There's a clock at behind you.
Oh, that's right.
I'm live casting it to 800 people.
Wow.
I don't set my watch.
Very good.
Keep in mind different PM.
Our arrangement is fine.
Yeah.
We need to figure how we can pick him up.
I'll pick him up at the hotel at 8:15.
I
Yeah,
can
he's
come.
coming. Yeah.
Me and you could pick him up, and everybody we can work
Okay.
together.
Yeah. Why not? Yeah.
So we meet where? In me and you. Where we meet in my office, your office.
I'll come to your office when? When you want to come?
We talk to the restaurant. They say it's better to come around 8.
We'll leave at 7:30.
We'll leave at 7:30. So we meet at 7:30
Yeah.
in my
Because
office.
I'll be taking him around to Niagara on the Lake.
Yeah. That's fine.
Okay, we'll talk after.
I see, yeah.
Because I'm not doing the I came back to Chicago after last year's job. I was 5 and number 18 was so full. So I said I had to do something.
That's why our finances get we will get there too.
Yes.
I mean, we have an amazing ability in academia. I would suggest that all of us once a year have to go to his office and give him a piece of paper as to how much he has to pay for us to stay. Then he can decide which slips to keep. The rest, bye. That would lower the salary.
So hard to agree for accounting. You don't have to have a PhD.
Yeah, but it's
And the market floor
You can start.
Good afternoon, folks, okay, friends and colleagues. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jim Ohlson to this university, and in fact, in my other capacity as recently president-elect of the Canadian Academic Accounting Association. It's an honor to have him visit this region, in particular Canada right now, or rather the GTA in general. So I'm wearing 2 hats, one as a faculty member at McMaster University. I'm a little envious that Jim is not visiting McMaster, but at least I take great kind of comfort in that he's visiting the region. So I recommend the Brock University folks to have brought Jim here.
That's a very generous introduction.
You're a very colorful personality, very productive, very, has a very distinguished past. Jim got his degrees from Berkeley. He's been on the faculty at Stanford, and then he's moved along, and then, and currently he is at Hong Kong Polytechnic, and he has, if you saw it, I think the bio is there. I don't want to read out the entire thing. He has numerous awards, in particular, for example, at the American Accounting Association. He has had multiple awards, a very distinguished contribution to literature, and in fact, the reassessment that he's trying to talk about archival and empirical research, I'm sure at some point in the near future, you'll probably get one more of the same awards. Contribution to literature, in particular, I wouldn't say contribution to literature, but rather contributions to saving the literature going forward. And in that context, let me then briefly kind of talk about the topic as well, because in my previous life as a budding econometrician, there were some very similar controversies in the economics literature. And let me read out, with your permission, I know you're going to talk about these things, a couple of jokes. So this is actually from a paper called Let's Take the Con Out of Econometrics by Edward Leamer in the AER of March 1983. And here it goes, and then we'll listen to you. It basically says econometricians, like artists, tend to fall in love with their models, lag unknown. Or how about there are two things you're better off not watching in the making: sausages and econometric estimates. With that, I leave the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that kind introduction. This talk of mine here is actually based on a paper, and the paper was based on a prior talk. The paper is published in Abacus, and I think it's called something like Common Sense and Empirical Research and Common Sense. And so I wrote that, and a lot of people read it, but the most interesting comment I had was from one of my friends in Beijing, and he said, it's really amazing that a paper like this has to be written. The point being is that much of what I'm talking about is sort of self-evident, and that to the extent I'm saying anything useful, I can tell you there is no lack of people who said more or less the same things. There will be a few new things, but I'd like to emphasize here is that I almost have to apologize. I'm not really going to talk about new things. But the reason it becomes of interest is that as a community of so-called scholars, we often put ourselves collectively in a bubble. And we tend to look at things from an empirical point of view in the sense of what people do. Presumably we've got to have some status, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. And so what I'm really doing is sort of a sign of age, because it's not, what we're doing today runs very much contrary to how I learned econometrics and economics. When I learned econometrics and economics, it turned out that early on they didn't have any data, they didn't have the computers. And then as a young assistant professors, the computers came along. And it came also with some wisdom how you're supposed to do data analysis. And my feeling is, it's sort of a little bit like self-centered, is that this wisdom has been lost. So what I like to do is to simply talk about a few things which are sort of fairly obvious. Your task in my mind is of course you can disagree, but the key thing is what you want to do is to be able to articulate for yourself. This is why I disagree. You can't just say, oh, he's talking about that, that's sort of his baby. Other people do things. You really need to articulate as to why you disagree, or if you agree, why you agree. So all the points I'm going to come up with here are basically extremely elementary. And so you sort of have to keep that in mind. Now, I probably do not have enough time here. As everybody else, we always have too many slides. I have 16, which is far too many. So some of the slides I will run fairly quickly, especially the early ones. But what I have in mind is a little bit first how I think about research. So you sort of know where I'm coming from. In other words, all research activities got to have a little bit of a philosophy to them. And I developed my own philosophy over the years. So I have to convey a little bit about how I think about research. And then it's a little bit about how you think about how to do data analysis. So then I'm going to talk about that. Then I'm going to sort of hit the literature over the head. In other words, many, many things we're doing, in my mind, and I don't like to say this, much of what we're doing is in fact sort of almost pathological. In other words, it clearly violates common sense. In other words, if you visualize that in research, that your life hinged upon getting things right, that there was some kind of referee, and you really got to arrive at correct conclusions, we would not be doing what we're doing. The reason we're doing what we're doing, of course, has much to do with incentives. And incentives are powerful. And people look around for what are the incentives, and that tends to be a determining factor. So I'm going to get into these things too. At the very end, I will also try to come up with some prescriptions as to what needs to be done. The way things are going here from a protocol point of view, my understanding is sort of roughly speaking, I'm going to talk for 1 hour and 15. And evidently, you're not supposed to interrupt me. But I think if there is something that needs clarification, I'll give you permission. And then we have 15 minutes, and then we can talk about, then I would like to listen to what you have to say. In other words, I'm coming out with sort of a bunch of messages here, and people react to it, for better or worse. all the feedback I get in front of my face, oh, this is going to be quite interesting and worthwhile. And then I get feedback, sort of in a roundabout way, and no good. All right, so that's where we're standing. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how to think about research question, and it's really my perspective on the basis of my experience. And again, there's nothing new here. The first thing is the novice problem. You want to be an academic. If I'm an academic, I got to deal with fancy words and I got to deal with fancy econometrics. And fancy words, fancy econometrics leads to fantasies. So many people end up with run into this problem here. And the way you experience this is that when you see these papers with fancy nouns and fancy econometrics, you say, well, I don't have to read it. Maybe I have to cite it. So then it goes away. That sort of ties in with the second point here is that we actually live in a very, very messy world. It is really quite complicated. I'm happy if I can show that leverage increases risk. And I'm happy to see that earnings increases actually tends to lead to stock prices. But it is very easy to come up with stories which easily get very shaky, and therefore we live in a messy world here. And so that sort of should keep us humble. The way I think about that is that in terms of that, there are many stories that you can tell, and they sound very, very reasonable, but still it may be that the data is not going to cooperate. And the way I learned that was sort of kind of interesting. It turns out that there's a very famous problem in economics, which has to do with the fact that women are underpaid. And we all feel that's a very reasonable story. Very reasonable. But it turns out that if you start to load up with controlling variables, the dummy is no longer significant. And the trick here is that you got to find things that correlate with women. So if you put in things like height, and you put in how if you spend time away from the labor force. So if you put a few of these things in, you're going to find that you have a very reasonable story, but you have to be prepared that if you have enough controlling variables, you're going to run into trouble. So there's nothing new about here. So that means that you really have your work cut out. You cannot have these fancy stories, but even if you have reasonable stories, you're going to potentially run into problem. It is not that easy to bring clean-cut evidence to hypothesis. And then the thing here is that, sort of another thing that comes later on here. If nobody's heard of your story, it probably is a fantasy. And the people look for supervision of thesis and so forth, they come and say, I want to do this and that. And I scratch, I never heard this. I'm an old man, I never heard things that is. And I say, why don't you go and read Financial Times? Start from the beginning. It's ultimately hypothesis, data analysis to be interesting. They have to connect with the real world. The real world means that you have to talk about things that are pre-existing. And if you start to come up with things that nobody's heard about, you're on your own. So these are actually very simple things and not always followed here. And then sort of again a few obvious things here that I think we all should recognize. Under the best of circumstances, research success is very, very difficult. And we have to live with that. But again here, if you really want to be successful as a researcher, if you really want to be that, try to pick problems that actually are what I call pre-existing. So that means that you can talk about it. You can talk about it with people in the real world. They write about it. These problems are pre-existing. So if you talk about leverage and risk, it is a pre-existing question. If you talk about PE ratios in emerging market versus developed countries, they're probably lower. It is a pre-existing question. The problem with pre-existing question, of course, is that they often have been dealt with, so it makes you scared. And the problem with pre-existing question is that if you want to research it, other people have opinions. So that means suddenly you have to know what you're talking about. This is scary. So if you take these fantasies, people don't really listen and says, it is what it is, and I don't have to worry about that. So people don't give you a bad time here. But in the end, that's what I always try to say, including when I talk to myself. Do I deal with the problem that actually exists? Okay, Again, what happens is that there are tons of papers floating around, and I studied this in great detail. And people come in, present papers, and it's a wonderful paper. And then you ask why, and we start to talk about the person. So there are all sorts of wonderful people who are very bright. They write papers that do not deal with problems that exist, and that means that people will remember you, but they will not remember the paper. So what I always try to tell people and encourage them to do research, try to come up with a paper so they remember the content. They will not remember you. You done it right. And a few more things here. Now we're going to get that down to data analysis here. And again, everything here is completely self-evident, I think, upon reflection. And the only reason for bringing it up here, because there are temptations due to incentives. So the first thing here is make it as simple as possible, but no more. And this is attributed to Einstein here. And the way I do my work here is that I always ask myself, if I never knew any statistics, what would I do? And there's a literature on data analysis which rejects statistics, to my surprise, aside from binomial tests and 2x2 matrices. But there are many, many, many things you can do in data analysis that does not require that you have to know any statistics, except for a binomial test and maybe a 2x2 matrix or something like that. But you don't have to know maximum likelihood estimation. You don't have to know some of this extremely fancy stuff that people are knowing. Another thing I started to notice here when I researched this area is that many people who have real money at stake and write books which are really supposed to help people in the real world, they do not talk about t-statistics and star. So the examples are here. There's a very famous guy, his name is Nate Silver, and he wrote the bestseller, which is called The Signal and the Noise. This is by a very famous probabilist, an academic, and he's famous in predicting betting markets in politics and so forth. So I read that book. What he emphasizes is, and this is sort of part of the message today here, don't fall back on the idea that you really need to produce p-values. It's an illusion that that's the right way of going. And that's sort of part of the way one wants to think about problems. P-values do not exist as a problem. P-values you can produce. And maybe people get impressed by it. Certainly if they train to get impressed by it, they will get impressed by it. So somewhere along the line, it really comes down to that you really have to reject stargazing as being a proper methodology of doing research. You have to do something else. And I get to that later on here. But this is sort of how I proceed, 2x2 matrices. Maybe I was too influenced by Ball and Brown. But if you want to, say, study discretionary accruals, and you could say, is it true that accruals increase when sales increase? So you get a 2x2 matrix. Have you checked that? If you have sales increases, do you have an increase in accrual? Well, that's sort of how it starts if you really care about the ideas behind accruals. Because that's the idea behind the Jones model. But if you want to bring in it to its core, start out by a 2x2 matrix. I actually start to always do positive and negative. So I work with free cash flows now. What proportion of companies have positive and negative free cash flows? Do you know? Should you know? Yeah, it turns out to be 50-50. But of course, if you take smaller firms, they tend to be negative. So I'm saying is there's much data work that can be done, that you should be done, which is extremely straightforward. But it presumes that you're guided by pre-existing questions. If you have a far-fetched question, you will not look at these things, because in some sense, you don't care about it. You care about the lofty things. Okay, so that's a sort of a little bit of the background here. And I have a few more things here, and again, they're extremely simple, and you find them again and again in many textbooks and whatever have you. So you have to bear with me. And the first thing here is, again, fairly self-evident. When you do the research, the uncertainty is not in the p-values. It is how you should frame the question. And the should here really pertains to how do I make it interesting. To make things interesting, you have to know what you're talking about. You got to have your feet on the ground. You got to know how the world works. That takes time.
and the readings are not going to be in econometrica. And maybe if you're lucky, you may even read it in a journal in accounting. But it really means that you have to pay attention to the real world. And I think also, at least in my own experience, what is extremely useful is teaching. Because teaching, you have to talk about things that count. Otherwise, you get feedback to the contrary. So then you may want to think about what are the real questions when you talk about these things. What is it that you would like to tell the students? It's not going to be dramatic. It's going to be a test of your understanding the real world. And what you do not know, you can find out, and it's probably not going to involve complexity. You may not have heard about the Michigan test. It's probably okay. So that's what you have to keep in mind here. Then as you move on here, and this is one of my pets, we live in a messy world. Conclusions are going to be ambiguous with high probability. It's just the nature of the world. And this is actually interesting, and I studied this here, that when is it that people come up with unqualified claims? And I actually spent some time on this. And it turns out that if you look at the literature, you can read that abstract, and you read introductions and summary. And in general, always, there is not a shadow of a doubt in the write-up as to what the proper conclusion is. None. And as you get into the paper, there will be a robustness test. And as I always say, don't talk about it, we know we worked out. I've been 50 years in this business. I have yet to ever have anyone present a paper saying, I worked out, I tried some robustness tests, but they didn't work out. So sad. No, it always worked out. And I have more to say about that. So somewhere along the line, you see, you have to change your mindset if you want to be, quote, the serious researchers. We live in a messy world. You should expect that depending upon how you frame the question, there might be nuances. You're going to get ambiguous conclusions. So if you take the problem, leverage and risk, sounds pretty good. But maybe if you look at the problem in a certain way, it is not quite going to be what you think it is. So you sort of have to be prepared for this here. And now it turns out here is this, why is this floating around? Why is it that everything is unambiguous? And the answer is I only have two things I've been able to come up with. And usually I enjoy myself when people have presentations because conclusions are always unambiguous, but they fall into two categories. And one is that some people are quite cynical. And you can see it from their body language when they present their papers. I have more to say about that later. But they recognize that if I want to write an abstract, I got to come up with a conclusion here. And we don't want any ambiguities, because if there are ambiguities, it suggests I don't know how to do fancy statistics. So people have strong incentives to come up with unambiguous conclusions. And if you think about your own efforts, you could probably, some of you know what I'm talking about. Now there's another thing here which is sort of a little bit more touchy, and that has to do with the fact that often people actually start to get involved in very far-fetched hypotheses, and they get emotionally involved. Now you can tell it from the presentations here. They have their emotions behind this is how the world works. And they like to pursue the whole thing, even though somewhere along the line one might think is, you don't really believe this. And so this is really one way of thinking about papers when they are presented. First, do they give you a hint that there are ambiguities? Answer, 95% of all cases, no, they're not ambiguous. And then you can ask the next question. Does the author really believe it? Or is it that they are naive? Now then, of course, there will be papers that actually have robust conclusions. And so it does happen. But the key thing is that you have to recognize it depends upon your sense of the real world. If you have a feel for the real world, you could see that many of the research questions asked and say, well, there might be some truth to it, but give me a break. It's not going to be clean cut. Then I get down to the next thing here, which I sort of it's really how I started out. This is sort of silly in a way, but I still stick to it. It turns out that when computers came around, people did not really know what all of these metrics meant from a very real sense. You know, I tell you the correlation is some number. What does it actually mean? So then we started to do simulations. And there were certain things that you should keep in mind. Correlations are very, very important. Pretty straightforward, but they are worthwhile to do. But don't ever forget that you cannot just look at p-values. P-values are the least useful information because it's just a question of n. Instead, what we were taught here is that keep the following thing in mind. If it's less than 0.1, not 0.01, you're not going to be able to tell if it's positive or negative. So that actually came out of very early computer work. They started to simulate X, Y, and they were normal, and they plotted the graphs, and they tested the students. What does it look to you? So unless it's 0.1, then nothing is there. Nothing is there. And that's useful. And sometimes people come in and represent papers, oh, we have 0.07 correlation, and we have a p-value and 3 stars and whatever it is. But the key thing is, just look at it. Why don't you give me a plot? There is no correlation. And then we have here 0.1 to 0.2, and this one you can pretend is good enough for an A journal, but you certainly would not write home about it. In other words, it's barely there. And then you have 0.2 to 0.3, and that's very distinctly there, and then greater than 0.3. So once you realize these things, I think what one does is what I do when I see all these empirical papers. I actually start out looking at the descriptive statistics to see if they have it right. And often you find out that they have this and that is going to connect. You look at a correlation, oh, less than 0.1. P-value, you have 3 stars, 20,000 observations. But you sort of prepare yourself that you're not going to get out of this low correlation by starting to introduce controlling variables. You're stuck. You don't have anything. 0.1 correlation or less really means that the naked eye would say this is nothing. And p-values are totally irrelevant. So these are the things I learned, and they sort of served me well, I think. Okay, now we get down to what people do. And we see examples of it on a daily basis. People run regressions. And the way it usually works, of course, is you regress x on y, so y is the dependent variable. And then we have something that we call controlling variables, so that's going to be the symbol C. So, you get used to this, people coming in with their job presentations, and, very quickly, you get the references, and here's y, and here's the variable of interest, and here are the controlling variables, and the controlling variables, where do they come from, or prior literature, which is in general not true. More about later. So this is what I call the VDJ, variable du jour. And there's a very peculiar thing about this, which is well to note, run very contrary to the way I learned econometrics way back at the inception of computers, because the focus there was supposed to be why. You're trying to explain why. And you have a string of variables, not many. The question is, what would the string look like? Instead, what we find here is that people don't care about why. So we have cost of capital, and then we have something, whatever it is, earnings management, or size of a board, or whatever. You can make a string of nouns and you pick it. And that's going to then be X. And then they have so I gave you sort of earnings mood management center, so it's very easy to read papers. And I actually suggested that, and I prepared a list of nouns. So you just draw these nouns from at random, and you have a paper. Tell a story. Well, do I have to tell a story? No, just look at citations. Okay, and then people sort of do this here, and it's sort of, I studied this, how this has evolved here, and of course it gets more complicated, more independent variables, and then now we have interactive effects, and bam, 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 and often you get, now they also have these fixed term effects, time effects, and so forth, and if you count the number of variables, including these effects, it's dozens, and it goes to 50, and it's ever expanding. And I try to get a handle on it, so I always say, well, we always have more independent variable, but on a per capita basis, You know, if you divide by the number of co-offers, it seems to be a little bit more steady. But even if you normalize for the number of offers, it still keeps increasing. Probably cannot go on forever. But this is sort of a fact. You know, you can just sample papers, and you find that there's an ever-increasing number of independent variables. And then you have these things here, and controlling variables, and they're supposed to be inherited, which is sort of a very peculiar way of doing research. So if you ask people, why do you use these controlling variables? Well, I follow the literature, but it's sort of not really an answer. But now if you start to check with it, and I did some samples, no, there are always mutations of the controlling variables. And why is that? Because you can't follow the literature because you're not going to necessarily get what you want. So therefore, you try different things. And then you get all of these things, you have fixed firm effects, and then now the time effects. And this is what I call the sausage making machine. We're talking about sausages. You know, they have the variables, and then they have X quantities, and the FFE, and FD, and then you have to remember to correct for the clustering, right? You have to correct for the clustering. And then we do all of this stuff here, and then we look at the stars, p-values, good enough, 3 stars, victory. But this is sort of how it runs, actually. I'm not saying that I get more about that later here. So basically what most people have to, what it really comes down to, and I talk to doctoral students and so forth, is that it's kind of touching, which it sounds very boring to me. But basically what you do is you come up with a story, and you have a dependent variable like cost of capital, whatever you like. And then you come up with something that's supposed to make you clever, and that's the variable du jour. This is the variable I'm concerned. And then you get all the controlling variables, which have some variations. It tends to be market to book. Nobody really knows why, and so forth. And they sort of lurking in the background, the controlling variables. And now we added on this FFE and FTE. And so people do this kind of stuff, and the good news is that you always get 3 stars. So that's pretty okay. The bad news is that you've got to get the right sign. So that means that you have to try different things until you get it right. And there's sort of something reasonable about that. You know, you sort of go building the model and you can't quite know what you're supposed to do. So you try a few different things. You know, you have specification problem, and you know, we need to worry about scaling here. And you have to scale this, you know, can be pretty bad. So there are all sorts of things that you need to do. But the purpose, of course, is to get what you want. You wouldn't expect anyone to say, oh, we run this regression, you know, it's 3 stars and we have a right sign. But you know what? We haven't really dealt with this, so let's try to do something else because we need to be a little bit more sophisticated. No, we have what we want. But then we get the diagnoses here, and this is a very peculiar thing. And I sort of studied this here. It has a certain amusement value. First of all, controlling variables are not inherited as tightly as you think they are. You know, there's always a reference to the literature, but often new things pop up. And after a while, you can sort of see how they pop up, because the name of the game is, it's sort of a little bit like what you learn in econometrics. You know, you want to show that a certain variable is significant with the right sign. So the exam question is, what do you need to put it in to get the variable to be of the right sign? Well, it depends upon how it correlates with dependent and so forth. So there are ways of bringing in independent variable, controlling variables to make sure that you get the right sign. And it turns out that these interactive effects play a very important role if you start to look at it closely. But another thing happens here, and you can check up, you know, your own experience. People tell their stories. Their variables are 3 stars, right sign, and you declare a victory. There's just one problem. Subsequent research does not recognize this as an appropriate controlling variable. And why is that? Because they don't really believe it was that important. So that's sort of 2 things that goes on. Often, common sense tells us it cannot be evaluated within substances. and it cannot be a controlling variable. So as the research goes on, there's sort of this sense of that you bring in variables after variable after variable, but in the end they do not get traction. Because for a variable to get traction, you really have to start from the beginning and ask, I want to explain something, why? Now the question arises, what should I put on the right-hand side? But that's not how this research is designed. It's designed is that I have my variable, the variable du jour, and I want to show you guys that I can get a p-value which is good enough. And when I write out, this is how the word works, and then everybody's supposed to swallow it. But of course, in the end, literature does not pay attention to the finding. And this one can study. So now this is sort of then what happens is that what is it that's really going on and what are the problems that we really want to confront? And here are the problems here. And much research in my mind, and I'm not alone in this, really revolves with the mental set that you're trying to validate rather than investigate. If you investigate, you have to have an open mind as to the findings. Most people do not want to have an open mind findings because you sort of, if you don't get significance, it sounds like a little bit like a stupid effort. So you want to show significance. It has to be significant. But that means that you get hooked into the idea that you want to validate rather than investigate it. It's a big step to move away from validation to investigation. It's a big, big mental set. But I try to, this is the problem. My task is I'm trying to do the data analysis as well as I can. What we find is what we find. I have no emotions about it. It's hard, but it can be done. Now there's another thing here. I don't know if you paid attention to this. Is that OLS is ever evolving. And it's moved into OLS Plus, which is very fortunate because it generates more screens. So the more screens you have, the bigger is the probability that you get the screen that you want. So OLS Plus is very consistent with the idea of validation because you're trying to show that this is how the world works. And therefore, I want not my hand tied. I want to be able to say that when we do OLS, you can do this, you can do that. And we don't know what the right specification is here. And you can actually see how this plays out in the literature in specific papers. So OLS Plus here is winsorization, trimming, scaling of variables, dummy variable controls, and interactive effect. If you try all of these things, you're going to get something which validates. And the point is that this, given that you do OLS, is not at all necessarily unreasonable. But if you want to do it, you've got to have a holdout sample, because otherwise you're engaged in classical overfitting. And combined with the fact that you have your emotions behind or incentives that you want certain findings, in some sense you're serious trouble. People say, well, we've got to winsorize, we've got to trim and so forth. And I says, well, how much? Well, I says, well, I try different things. And I always robustness. Well, if it doesn't make any difference what you do, why do you do it in the first place? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Trimming and winsorization. So how do you do it? I tried this, I tried that, and I always get the same thing. All robustness results hold up, we always hold up. And says, if you know that it doesn't make any difference, why do you do it? Then, of course, in addition, the winsorization is, as has been pointed out many times when it came around, it's a little bit like you winsorize to get rid of outliers. So it's actually a very peculiar system. You have outliers, and then you introduce fictitious outliers. Because these points that you winsorize will still be very important in the estimation. So it's a very peculiar way of doing data analysis. You introduce fictitious numbers, and then you use these fictitious numbers as being the driving force to get what you want. And so you can sort of study interactive effects are very peculiar too, because it turns out that when you do interactive effect and you combine it with OLS, if you don't get 3 stars, I don't know what's going on.
Is trimming better than?
Huh?
Is trimming better than winsorizing?
I'm sorry?
Trimming better than what's
Yeah, I think it, but of course, you see, I have a totally different take on it. This is that you want to engage in research which is suitable for what you're doing, but you get your arms tied. You only get to do it once. This is it. So I get to that. But otherwise, you know, sort of, yes, trimming is a little bit better. But trimming is very peculiar because what you do is to say, I want to show the following thing. I don't think these observations fit what I want to show. So what do? Throw them out. Want to do that? Go ahead. Now, also, of course, and this is a very interesting problem, if you start to do this kind of work, your ethics will get challenged. And I could ask a question, how many have been involved in dubious practices? Up with your arm, because we won't get it.
I trimmed.
Huh?
I did trimming in my work. Everybody does one.
No, trimming, I'm talking about the final rep.
Well, here's the thing. I was going to ask you about this. So these things are, like when we teach our students about ethics, we say, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's ethical.
No, what I'm saying is, as a serious researcher, if your life hinged upon getting things right, you wouldn't do it this way. If your life hinged upon getting it right, but your life does not hinge upon it. Nobody ever gets busted for coming up with false positives. I never heard of anyone say, "Oh, he wrote this paper. You know, it has a false positive. You know, he or she got it demoted." You know, as long as you can publish, nobody asks any questions if the conclusion is valid or not. I mean, sometimes you get controversies, and people do work on things. It's not that simple. But the problem is that certainly this, in my mind, has become an important problem because of the nature of evolution of incentives. And just to be sure is that am I more ethical? No, but it turns out when I was young, you really didn't have to worry about these things because it's fairly easy to publish. Down to the tail end of a project, and suddenly something comes out the wrong way. Are you going to start to talk about that in the paper? No, you're not. So many people, they write papers and they know that if they gave a full account of all the screens they looked at it, it's really going to be very ambiguous and dubious what the conclusions are all about. Well, that's not surprising because the real world is extremely messy. It depends upon how you frame the question. There are many ways you can do it.
Excuse me. I don't do moisturizing and trimming in research, but I do scaling.
Yeah, I know, but the key thing is, then the question is, you try many scalars. How do you know what the right scalar is? When you get what you want. But that's
levels.
what happens. There are ways around it. I'm going to get that very shortly. But that's what happens, I think. I talk to people. Actually, I met PhD students, and it touched my heart. There was actually a rumor around that if you really want to get free start, you should work with these interactive effects. They rarely disappoint you. You know, they really give you things. Spine, yeah. Okay, more problems here. So then here, this is how it comes down to, and this is my favorite, because I started to study this 15 years ago. So if you look at the empirical research, the way it's presented, there has been an evolution over time. And the evolution is very interesting because it really is, in the end, my interpretation, is intended to deceive. Of course, some of us, we do not get deceived because we have a little bit too much experience. And here's what happened over the years. The first thing that comes to mind when you do this kinds of research here is that, you know, you start to introduce X, you know, that's your variable. You know, it's very important. More diversity, things like that. Earnings management is really important. And then you start saying, if I delete this variable, what happens to R squared? Usually, it's the same up to the first 3 digits. And then we say, well, the textbook tells you you're not supposed to look at R squared. And I say, well, textbooks say that, but you do look at it. And in any event, it doesn't give you a nice warm feeling that R squared has not changed. It doesn't give you a nice warm feeling. And so people resort to these things. And so this was a problem, but for a period of time, maybe say 5 to 10 years ago, people actually used to prepare their tables where they showed with and without. And then it disappeared. And then I come to realize is when people start to present their paper, there's often the bottom line missing. That was the bottom line with R squares. Because it's a gamble that people don't read papers in advance and so forth. And instead, they start to focus on, oh, I have 3 stars, p-value. And suddenly, somewhere along the line, of course, people realize that a p-value has no information content unless it comes with an n. Have you heard this? Significance has no meaning unless you know the n, number of observations. And so that sort of comes down to the next exciting level. And if you study people's body language when we give presentations, you can actually see the strategies they're using to get out of the box. You know, you can do it with some speed, you know, something like that. Or more often, which is quite popular, is that you manipulate the tables in such a fashion that it doesn't get any attention. There's absolutely no discussion about the role of n frequency. No discussion. None. And you don't have to have a PhD in statistics to recognize that n is very important when it comes to statistics. And again, I draw upon my memory as I learned about the square root formula. You know, that there's a different way, and it's actually very straightforward. But the key thing is if you have 20,000 observations and you get the t-statistics of 3.1, it doesn't give you a nice warm feeling. There's probably nothing going on. So I'm saying is why don't you discuss it? I give you, if you want to interpret that this is significant and in some sense relevant, it's your call. But at least you can inform the reader that there's a way of looking at what's been done so far, which suggests that with this perspective, not much is going on. But people don't do that. And then you get down to, and this I try on people here, this is so bad that it cannot even be talked about in a seminar. It's a little bit like going to church. I mean, there's sort of a limit upon what you can talk. You know, we're all Christians and whatever in the church, and there's certain things you can't sort of bring up a discussion about this and that. You know, you have to stick to the dogma. This violates basic rules. It is that, and it's elementary, and it's very common. If you introduce a variable, it might well have a significant t-statistics, but the bad news is more often than not, if you delete the variable, you get better goodness of fit. And moreover, it's not that hard to check. It's very easy to check. And the way this came about was that way back, something that dropped out is something we call stepwise regressions. Have you heard about this? Yeah. And so the idea was way back is that there are very few things that count. So let's try to find out what counts. And so you do stepwise regression, and it's basically sort of a simplistic algorithm, but these are the few 4 or 5 variables that count. The rest is just background noise. What it meant was that the t's might well be significant. That's a question of n. But from a point of view of goodness of fit, make no mistake, you're just introducing noise. And if you think that that's irrelevant, there are arguments why this is not terribly relevant, but for some readers, it is relevant that you have introduced noise. I don't like to think that, you know, the corporate activities on that kind and that kind, social responsibility, you know, has an impact upon cost of capital. And maybe 60,000 observations. T-statistic is free. And the obvious thing is you just delete the variable and you get better goodness of fit. When I mean better goodness of fit, I don't talk about statistical significance. I'm saying if you don't look at R square and you use some other metric, this metric of goodness of fit will go down. My favorite test is that you use relative accuracy score. You know, you have 2 models, and they project variables, and you check out which one is the closest to the actual variables, and then you do your binomial thing. It's easy to understand. It's like a video election. But this is important, and I actually tried this on people. You guys can try too. But I tried it with some people, and you know, people present papers saying, "Oh, they're very interested in, you know, knowing what happens if you delete your variable." Oh yeah, I'll get back to you. And I think I've done it 6 or 7 or 8 times. Never hear a peep. So here's the deal, folks. From your point of view, you've got to make up your mind is that you are indifferent or whatever have you, and I'm not going to care about this. I'm not going to do it. Everybody seems to be doing fine without bothering about this. The problem is that you actually check out what's happening, people increasingly in the audience will be aware of it. So don't think that you can avoid this aspect always, because people are increasingly becoming aware of it. And I refer to this as being the elephant in the seminar room. In other words, people may not talk about it, but they are aware of it. And if you want to go in and present your paper and try to finesse this point, go ahead. But the probability of every people sitting out there, something is missing, is going to be an increasing number. So I'm saying is that, well, how do we get out of these problems? Well, pose a problem so you're comfortable with whatever you find. And you're doing fine. Don't worry about what you find. This is a symptom that people have a validation agenda. They don't have an inquiry. They're not looking at what is the proper way of thinking about this problem. Does it go this way or does it go that way? It depends upon how we look at it. If you look at it this way, what's the other? No, the way it happens is this is how the world works. I write it in my abstract. There are no qualifications. And to the extent there exist tests that brings to bear upon them from a different point of view, stay away from them. And people know about it, but everybody else is staying away. Why do you have to pick on me? That tends to be the attitude. Why do you have to pick on me? Why do I have to do it? Nobody else does it. Well, I'm over the hill. Don't worry. So this is sort of the one thing I sort of like to think that is sort of a useful takeaway from your point of view. That I feel that, I'm not questioning my being right or wrong. There's absolutely nothing new about this. Nothing. But you have to come to grips, I feel, how to deal with this. Because increasingly people, it has nothing to do with me. People will become more aware of this. Okay. Now there's a few other things here. And again, it's absolutely trivial, this. There's nothing new about it. And people often talk about powerful tests and so forth. And there's this Peterson thing that everybody's doing. The
Clustering?
Clustering. No, fixed effects and so forth. A massive statistical, but the argument is sort of you want the maximum power. It sort of replaced the Fermat-Macbeth. Why did it replace the Fermat-Macbeth? Because if you start to do Fermat-Macbeth, you may end up in trouble. You don't get what you want because it's quite stringent. So if you disallow, so basically the whole idea is that you don't want to come up with I'm sorry, did I have this right? But disallowing a false negative, in other words, in statistics, what they actually teach you is true. So false negative means that you're accepting the null hypothesis, and maybe your story is true, but you ended up falsely to accept the null. Nobody would ever do such a thing. Run a statistical test where I'm risking the possibility of falsely rejecting the hypothesis that I want to prove. I'm never going to do that. And that sort of goes through in the literature. Because people used to do much cruder data analysis. It's a little bit like the famous Fermat random walk hypothesis, his thesis. He found that the random walk actually holds up. And to some extent, one can just view it. He didn't have a very powerful test. He ended up with a false negative. But if you do that, if you do it this way, then you have to keep in mind that you're really engaging in a research design where you're maximizing the probability of a false positive. And that's sort of really what people are doing, because they don't care about false positives. They want to maximize the probability of rejecting, false or not. And that's why people are doing what they're doing. And that's why this Peterson, fixed firms effect and all these things are so popular, because if you can't reject it, if you can't reject null, then there's no hope. Now there's another thing here that some of you have had some probability theory. It's never ever mentioned. If you have your PowerPoint, you can look these things up. And it has to do with a very simple classical result. As you increase n,
Power increase.
Yeah, but the probability of a false positive increases. False positive. As n increases, you are gradually increasing the probability that you will reject the null. And that's why people do things to counter this. And then another thing, of course, is that this controlling variables. And it's sort of fun to see how that happened. As I indicated, usually people say, oh, it's pre-existing literature. And I don't know how that comes about, the pre-existing literature. I mean, somewhere along the line, the chain has to be broken. But with the passage of time, what really happens is that they actually change the right-hand side. They change the controlling variables. And the peculiar thing now, if you check papers in general, you find that you have size or some a few things. It gets the best p-values if you can sort of tease that out. And then usually the variable du jour comes in early on. You know, it's sort of this number 2 or number 3. And then you have lots of controlling variables. They may come in with no stars. And moreover, some of them may have wrong signs and 3 stars. You think that then I could say is that maybe something is going wrong here. And lucky you got the right sign. Because the controlling variables, many of them got the wrong signs and 3 stars. So it could have happened to your variable du jour, but it didn't happen. So I said, congratulations, you're lucky. Are you with me? So, so what's right in the background here is that in the good old days, so to speak, they actually quite carefully sat down with pluses and minuses and they checked it and they discussed it. The pluses and minuses have increasingly disappeared. But that's naturally to happen because as you expand the number of independent variables and you put in this firm effects and the time effects, you see you start increasingly to get the wrong signs. And they increasingly start to be irrelevant because it's all absorbed by all of these dummy variables. And so who wants to discuss that? So we don't. And so this is sort of the Achilles heel in my mind, is this sort of controlling variables. And this is really peculiar because people actually do not check. If we're serious scholars, do you think we should check a little bit? But we don't. But they change. And they are expanding. Now I get down to the prescriptions. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what I think you ought to be doing. And again, you can take it for what it's worth. I mean, it's always easy to hand out advice. And as the saying goes, I hand out my advice for free. And that's probably what it's worth. So don't worry. And the first thing, of course, is don't start with research when you want results. Don't start research when you want results. Phrase the question, keep an open mind. The name of the game is to do good, solid data analysis. And conclusions probably can be quite ambiguous. The real world, after all, is messy. Your task, Mr. or Miss, is to try to make it interesting by connecting it to the real world, more so than pre-existing research. And then it's sort of a little bit like, you cannot focus on the X here. It's sort of peculiar how people do this. You have my X variables, and then you have lots of citations, and Y, cost of capital, whatever it is in the background, and then you have controlling variables is in the background. But it's not really how one reads textbooks in econometrics. They often says that the name of the game is to try to explain why. And it's a hard task, because you only need a few things. And it depends upon the details how you do these things. So we get back to here, and sort of repeat here. Another thing is that, and this is really bad news because it's very radical, is that if you live in the real world and you want to explain why, there's nothing in the history of data analysis to suggest that you should need more than 4 or 5 variables. So when people come up with these things with 50 variables, it turns out that works very nicely with OLS because it's very generous with stars. And that's why you can sort of, if you expand N and you do OLS, there's sort of a race with getting stars. And OLS is very generous with stars. I mean, again, the peculiar things about this, that there are hundreds of papers explaining why t-statistics are always overstated. There are 0 papers why they're understated. Well, I'm exaggerating, but it's sort of true. But it doesn't take much to see that the t-statistics are heavily biased upwards. And often the bias increases with N. You ever see a discussion on that? Do people ever talk about it? Well, there are ways of dealing with it. And so this is sort of, you can come to grips with these things if you want to. And I think one should here. Here's sort of trivial things. People don't do this sometimes, very rarely. If you have lots of data, split the data, tune the model on the first 10,000 observations, and then evaluate, did you accomplish anything? The way I learned about that, we talked about you have to build models, in most cases you build models, but you have to test and evaluate the model. You have to be put to test. And that means that you have to divorce yourself from the estimation procedure. In other words, you cannot have self-evaluations. You've got to put what you have into a new environment. And I think that if you don't do that, you should tell the reader why you're not doing it. You may have your own good reasons. Maybe you don't like it. But you should tell the reader why. And you can rest assured that if you ever present papers and you do not do these things, there are plenty of people sitting in the audience. They're well aware of that you could have done it. They're suspicious about why you haven't done it. It doesn't mean that they're going to raise their voices. But people are aware of it. And in some cases they do it. For example, if you look at the Fisher-Morgan literature, there's a long history of using whole-dot samples. And then I get down to this point here, t-statistics, you should always assume that they're overstated. You should assume that the degree of bias increases with n. There are hundreds of articles written about these things. And it turns out that if you really pay attention, OLS is very peculiar because the x's are supposed to be taken as fixed. You know what? They're not fixed, they're random. So there's another source of uncertainty, and that brings up the t-statistics. So that doesn't mean that you cannot calculate it, but if you're a serious scholar and you use 20,000 observations and you get the t-statistics of 3.1, you can't just leave it at that. You have to recognize more needs to be done. And there's plenty of stuff that can be done if you're willing to accept the fact that you may end up accepting the null hypothesis. So here's another comment. It's very, again, the good old days. I'm sort of revealing my age here. But then don't talk about p-values without talking about n. Because you don't have any adequate information to make a judgment. N is important. The reader deserves to know n. The readers can disagree what it means, but it's not an n all to do p. And I don't think you see anything. And then avoid playing OLS plus. And then it gets down to what I said earlier here. Certainly, you may want to build a model. And you're not sure if you do it this way, or maybe I should do it that way. I don't know. Maybe I should try that scaling, and maybe I should use book to market rather than market to book. By all means, go ahead. But leave parts of the data to test out what you've been doing. So, how was you overfitting? And you don't need a PhD for this one. You are overfitting. And there are easy ways to avoid it. Very easy ways. So you should avoid playing these OLS plus games. Plus is fine, provided we use the whole-dot sample, and then we get down. Can I explain why better? And here now, finally, I get down to what's a little bit my own favorite things here. Is I actually come to the conclusion, and now you have to appreciate I'm a little bit biased, but I did some homework many years ago about if you don't do OLS, what can you do? So of course, if you look at the literature, there's a massive literature on estimation techniques. I mean, it is endless. So you arrive at some basic conclusion. OLS has no known virtues, except that it's sort of nice math, and you show it to your friends and relatives. Oh, I'm a real PhD person here. And you know, you do all of this X prime X, X prime Y. It looks very impressive, you know, and you have p-lim and stuff like that. So there's a very nice algebra associated with OLS. And people sort of fall in love with it. It used to be also comparative advances in computations, they all gone. The problems here is that it has no known virtue, exceptions being practical academic research. And that means that you can get involved, you get overstated t-statistics, which is very nice since you're trying to validate. It's nice to get overstated statistics. And moreover, you can do speed picking because everybody knows that you have to try different things because OLS has such emphasis on the extremes. So what I did was my homework a little bit, so I asked myself and the eventual literature, what is the simplest thing you can do? And it turns out there's something called TS. It's Thiel-Sen. It goes back 60 years. It's quite computer insensitive, by contemporary standards, no problems. And the way it works, TS, is really quite wonderful. It's simpler than OLS. And the way it works is here. It's very easy to describe. Let's see you have 3 independent variables. Pick 3 observations at random. Solve for A, B, C. Repeat, and pick the medians. Is that clear? It's easier than OLS. And in fact, one can sort of reconcile with OLS, and once you really start to do these things, you find out, of course, it works better. But the first point is that the simplest possible thing you can do is actually TS. And then what happens is now that the second point, now outlier problems cease to exist because it's non-parametric. So if you start to delete outliers, you get the same thing. Things are not going to change. It's just like median versus mean. You know, you can delete the outliers, but it's not going to change the median. And the same thing is true here. So you don't have to worry about outliers, but worry has 2 dimensions to it. Maybe I want to keep my outliers so I can try different things when I winterize and trim. So this is, your arms are tight now. Moreover, scaling makes no difference. Now your arms are really tight. So and that's sort of the beauty of TS, is that you don't have to worry about scaling. There is no such thing any longer as a size effect to worry about. So that's sort of what happens when you have a dollar model. So it's actually quite wonderful. And once you get used to it, you sort of tend to stick to it. And you shouldn't really take my word on this. You can go to the textbook. But if you really are interested in things, you can actually spend an afternoon running some simulations. And then you see what happens. Other people done it. And then you arrive at the conclusion. Think about OLS as being TS plus noise. It's quite remarkable. It's quite dramatic. I wish I could claim credit for this. But I use this now quite extensively. And most people are very uncomfortable because you have to leave your comfort zone. And you don't have t-statistics any longer, and God knows what's going to happen, and what are my colleagues going to say? Why are you not doing OLS? Well, I heard about someone's talking about TS. Well, we do OLS in our business, so this is no good. But if you do this, everything now changes. So this is sort of really why I care about this. I want people to think about it. You can do your OLS, but the key thing is that there are more efficient estimation techniques, but all bets are off now. And what's going to happen is that you no longer get overstated statistics. You can easily do p-value stuff. You could do the bootstrapping, and you can do all sorts of things. So it's not that you cannot find out it, but the focus now when you do this is, did it really help me to put this variable on the right-hand side? If it doesn't help, you don't get 3 stars. You have to live with that. So you better ask a question here now, because there will be only a few things that show up. Only a few things that count. The same thing, of course, is true with OLS, but it gets masqueraded by the 3 stars. But when the R square doesn't change in 3 digits, make no mistake, you added nothing. Even if 4 stars, 5 stars, or whatever, you have added nothing, because you need more. So this is what's going to happen here. And that means, in my mind, you can get back to very basic research. You can actually ask yourself, if I want to explain why, what do I really want to put on the right-hand side? Suppose you want to explain returns using accounting variables. What do you really want to put on the right-hand side? You can only put so many things, because otherwise it's not going to work. And that leads to bootstrapping here. And so if you want to do bootstrapping, you can do that here. Now, of course, you can do bootstrapping for OLS too, but that doesn't happen. And so I started to check into this. Because I think somewhere along the line, early 80s or something like that, everybody said that we want to do bootstrapping. And of course you can do bootstrapping, you can bootstrap t-statistics in regressions. So everyone says that's going to be the future. So time passed here and there was some bootstrapping, because then they wanted to accept the null, in other words. So if you don't do bootstrapping, you end up in trouble. But with the passage of time, bootstrapping of regressions, I never see them. I never see them. And so I started checking into it, and then someone cracked sort of a joke. I'm not surprised who says, did people ever do bootstrapping? And it says, oh yeah, people have been doing bootstrapping. So what happened? I don't see it. Of course you don't. You don't get what you want. You don't get what you want. The t-statistics will be much bigger. And, but it is a fine technique. So the question you face as a researcher is, do I want to engage in data analysis that gives me significant probability of accepting the null, even though I have this story? It's a very uncomfortable proposition. You need some help. Overstated t-statistics per over less plus screen picking. Then, you make it. So then I have this, I found this in a textbook here, and I think it's really quite wonderful. You can read about it. It's a textbook about bootstrapping, and they have to recognize is that you don't see much bootstrapping. So then the author wants to discuss, why don't we see bootstrapping? So and it says here, this is that, yeah, the common practice, no, then it says it's a lack of familiarity, which should get rid of. And then it says here is that what people really do, of course, is that they get overstated t-statistics. And then what author ends up saying here is that the researchers are understandably reluctant to report on the standard errors when the usual calculations indicate greater precision. It is best, however, not to fool yourself, regardless of what you think about fooling others. And I think there's an element of very strong truth to this. And my feeling is if you really want to embark upon, quote, serious research, you really have two steps that you need to deal with. First of all, you got to be brutally honest to yourself, which is very hard under the best of circumstances in a variety of situations. And I think I've been as prone to fool myself too. We often like to think what we're doing is better than it actually is. And that's very natural and very human. So it takes a certain mental discipline. I'm not going to do that research that way. And then you have the next thing. Do you want to fool others? I mean, that's sort of a decision you face. Do you want to withhold screens? What's the question? For this, I'd like you to remember here. I think it's so nicely written, this paragraph here. All right, so here am I, a little bit my summary here. And it's sort of rather random. But you can think about this, and I think I sort of indicated to you earlier, the issue is not whether you agree with me or disagree with me. The issue that you need to confront is why you agree or why you do not disagree. And that's sort of really, to the extent I'm saying something useful today, I like to think that you confront these issues and try to find narratives as to how you want to proceed. Because these problems here, again, they're not new, it's not mine, and I have no problems rounding up people who think very similar to what I do, especially if they have gray hair or no hair, as the case may be. So that's true. So if you are young and you want to embark upon research, I think I could fairly say that the problems I've been talking about today, they're not going to go away. You're going to have to confront them, one way or another. And it's of course up to you. And so here are the few things here. Somewhere along the line, you really have to come to grips that if you introduce a variable x on the right-hand side, you need to ask the question, does it really help to explain the dependent variable? You need to come to confront that. And to finesse the whole issue and say, I don't want to deal with it, I don't think that's going to work in the long run. But I might be wrong. And then don't do, if you really want ones, don't do OLS plus unless you have a holdout sample. Don't sit there and experiment. That's what people do. by all means experiment, but leave a hole doesn't. And then I also encourage you, learn how to live with ambiguous conclusions. It is much harder because the way you have to compete in research is to make things interesting. Right now we have a protocol, it ends with declaring victory. But you don't have to be interesting. But if you have ambiguities, you see, you have to create the narratives that engages the reader, that we have to live with ambiguities, because the world is messy. And it depends upon how you phrase the question. That takes time, effort, and you have to put in incredible effort in learning how to write and so forth. But in the end, this is what's going to be required if you want to plan to generate research that is actually read, rather than just shows up on CDs. And that sort of focus on pre-existing issues. And also keep in mind here is that research uncertainty deals with how you frame questions. That's what you have to think about. It's not the matter of rushing away to p-values or stargazing. It's not the road to insights. There are many ways you can phrase questions. How do you want to frame it? Okay, and then also keep in mind that the end is very important. And then final 2 points. Stay away from emotional story validation and make the end as simple as possible. So that's sort of my little message today. But again, having said it's my little message, is really, I have subscribed to a common view of what research is all about. I don't think I've said much new. The only thing is about my little favorite, the TS stuff, which I really think is quite wonderful. Which is so simple. That's it. Now, maybe we have time for questions.
We have 15 minutes for questions.
Huh?
Yeah.
Sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for your great presentation. All the prescriptions in here are mostly for me as researchers, right? There are situations when we have a reviewer who insists on certain right-hand side variables, even though as a researcher.
Yeah, I know, it's tragic, yeah.
So what do we do then? What are our prescriptions, right? I mean, at some point, I need to survive to be able to implement all these things.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there are, quote, the incentives, and we can talk about this, and I'm over the hill, so I don't have to worry. The talk is it's double cheap. My feeling is the following thing. It's sort of my personal experience. I had always problems publishing my important papers. I never published, I've never had any problems with the less important paper. So I get sort of a citation list of all my papers, and I look down the list. Oh, I never had any problems here. If I go up the list, I had problems. But in the end, I have the following thing to say. First of all, you got to be a little bit stubborn. But when you do your papers, in the long run, you're going to be better on being brutally honest. Then you turn that corner when you get down to it. I think when people anticipate that I have to do this and that, and anticipate that these potential reviewer, I think people totally overestimate the extent to which they can manipulate probabilities by anticipating what the reviewer is going to say. And my feeling is when it comes down to these reviewer things, is that you have to have a strategy of wearing them out. And that means that you do this and that. If a memo you get from reviewer is 2 pages, you come up with a memo of 6 pages. Because people love their time. And in the end, they don't really care about it. And so that's one way of doing it. But we all suffer from this publication imperative. And do we suffer? We do. And each to his own. But personally, I don't think that you should put your time and effort in pleasing the reviewers, because I don't think you're going to tilt the probability. The way you tilt the probability is really spend time learning how to write. Spend time learning actually how to read. In the end, these are long-term investments, but they have very good payoffs. And if I have to give you practical advice, never co-author any paper unless you are the writer. The reason is that the human capital in our business is really writing skills. Do you believe me? So you could talk all sorts of things, and you agree with me? Yeah. No, I mean, I've learned it the hard way. That's why it comes very close. You know, the people. You see, then you can write the 6-page memo. It just takes you, an afternoon. Just write it down. You wear people out, and then ultimately, the papers you write, if they are well written and they deal with pre-existing problems, they will get read. It's very rare papers get read. But if you make a list of the papers that are read, you can easily see that they deal things that are pre-existing. In other words, you could have a quick lunch conversation and people would see, oh, this problem actually exists. And they try to write it up well, and they try to keep a very sharp focus. And that's it. But broadly speaking, if I address it to it, we do have this problem with in terms of how we do research. And if I may summarize, you see, and I don't say it quite as lightly as it might sound, is that the way we teach people is sort of, we have an obedience school. And there are three things people hold the trinity of a PhD program in accounting, and it's probably in finance. It's a holy trinity. You can come up with a one-to-one map between the new thing. Regressions, 3 stars, and science. This is what people visualize our things about. Regressions, 3 stars, and then science. And science is sort of a stand-in for thoughtfulness, intellectual activity that might go wrong, trying to make things interesting. Instead, you just ramble, citations, and it's supposed to be 70, I think, now? Let me check. 70, sorry. And you don't have to read it, you don't have to understand it, you just do it this way. And the reason is that people need hits. You have kids, and they're going to need dental care. I need hits. It's really that simple. And so that's what people do. Now what happens is, you see, if you give up, unless it's sort of, suppose we start to do TS and things like that, you see, then the whole edifice just collapses, because you're not going to get your stars any longer. And once you don't have your stars, then the next leg comes in. All the system of finding an intellectual foundation by citation, it also collapses. So that means that the whole edifice collapses. So that's why people are going to hang on to it. The way we're doing things now is okay. And the reason I know that is that everybody is doing it, and we wouldn't be doing it unless it was worthwhile. And you can subscribe to that. It's perfectly fine. It just happens I don't, but that doesn't mean anything. But that's sort of where it's standing. I mean, in other words, somewhere along the line, I think things are going to sort of, in my mind, collapse a little bit. Now, this has happened before in the social sciences. You know, people used to do things like Freudian economics, and we keep running at it for 20 years, it collapses. And somewhere along the line, I think this triplet, you know, the Holy Trinity, regressions, triple stars, and citations, I think somewhere along the line, it will go out the window. Now, that's not the only thing we're doing. So there are plenty of stuff which serves as role models, and there's plenty of fairly careful research. So it's not all, you can't just say everything is sort of this and that. It's just that most people are trained as a first way of dealing with this brutal world where you have to get hits. I'm going to run regressions, I'm going to find my stars, and I'm going to put in all the sites. I put it up, it's supposed to be 40 pages or something like that. You can't have a movie which is not 2 hours. The movie is 2 hours. Paper is 40 pages. Citations is 70. And now, in terms of the regressions, the sausage making machine, which is put in FFE, put in FTs, and don't forget to correct the T statistics for clustering, because that's expected. Do you have to understand what you're doing? No. That's the good news. And above all, you're not challenged to do something that's interesting. And the reality is, of course, as a student, it's quite demanding to learn all of the things you're supposed to learn. You can't do that thing. So to engage in a more distant critical thinking is really quite scarce. I only got involved in this stuff as critical thinking because when I was young, we didn't have any data. So I actually had to sit down and think about, like was common in those days, how do we arrive at conclusions? You don't have to think about how we arrive at conclusions. We have a protocol. Follow the protocol. And I expect if I've done it right, including not hurt any feelings by missing citations, not hurt feelings, it's very bad, then I expect to have a fair and decent probability of getting a hit. And that keeps me on payroll, and I can pay for my kids' dental care.
You mentioned how the biggest problem here maybe is because people respond to incentives, right? That's why the game is played the way it is. I'm just wondering, clearly all the senior editors of the top journals, they know exactly what you're saying here today.
No, because you got to keep in mind that they benefited from it, and you should not underrate the extent to which people can get involved in self-deception.
Okay.
In other words, if the system served me, it ain't that bad.
So even though
it ain't that bad. This is pretty good what we're doing. This is serious research, and I think, and I say that in all due respect. It just happens that I see it differently. But there are different points of view, and it really falls back to what I'm saying here is that we can't run around and start to innovate methodological innovations. So we work on it slowly, and right now it centers around the sausage-making machine. And that's what it is. So I think some of my senior colleagues, like I think Ray Ball would say, he's even more gray here than I do. But if you go down the sort of the people 10 years younger and so forth that run JAR and GE, I wouldn't say that they, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful thing, but there are plenty of people who've been doing quite well, thank you very much, using this kind of research, and they're not going to say, oh, this is all screwed up. They're not going to say that. So you got to keep that an open mind. It ties in with your comment. You know, I have a paper now for review. I guess I'm going to direct it. I'm using TS, you know, and it's kind of shaky, you know. You can't use TS. What are you doing? Yeah.
I want to point to one problem, in addition to what you pointed, that in accounting literature, there is a lot of variable measure the same in proxy. Example.
Yeah.
You talk about information asymmetry. You will get bid-ask spread, you put size, you put number of analysts, you put variance of analysts.
Whatever you like, yeah.
Whatever you like. And that's open the door. You try one, if it doesn't work, try the other. That's one side of the problem. But not only that, some of these proxies also can be used for another construct. Bid-ask spread, you could use it for information asymmetry, then you talk about liquidity, then you go...
But you see, that's where the sites play such a
you go to this issue. So this is in addition to this problem, but the second my notes is with regard to these questions that raise, which is related to motivation. What motivates, researcher, either PhD students, to engage, or other researchers to engage in such activity? And it's happened that we have such debate with some of the editor. The perception is that if I don't find anything, there is no finding. You need to throw the paper. There is a rule tell you, even if you find nothing, the no finding is a finding, by itself. But the question is, this is a perception from our side or from the side of the editor. And the answer was that you can do such work, however, the burden of the proof is gonna be a little bit more. And the third problem is that relative accounting research relative to science, research, it is difficult to replicate, studies. I mean, if Jim Ohlson, for example, publish a paper, everybody gonna cite him, and nobody will dare to say, well, let me take his data and check it, again, or replicate.
No, but people start to do that. Where we take the in other words, for one thing, you will see is studies being forthcoming when we check up, did it add to goodness of fit? That's going to be a lot of fun. That will be forthcoming. Somewhere along the line, people will see this is a really easy research project to. You just replicate what people are doing, and then you check out, did it add to goodness of fit? You pick 10 studies, and you can report whatever you find. Well, you see, that's why I agree with you. Is that somewhere along the line you run into the difficulty that the world doesn't revolve around black and white.
No.
And the way you get out of the black and white is really by something which is very difficult to deal with. You have to make things interesting. So most of us, we develop interests, and we find things interesting. And the reason we find things interesting is precisely because it's not black and white. So that's sort of, but that's very demanding to learn. And that's why the younger people, you know, quite natural, you want something, I want to show X. You know, this is, you know, you sort of a little bit like, you know, you read the abstracts and they have a complete certitude. They read very much like religious tracts. You know, this is how the world